Welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast. I'm Jonathan, and I'm here to help you end 24/7 food thoughts, binge eating, and actually enjoy life with food. This episode is for educational and informational purposes only, not to be substituted for medical or personalized advice. Check the link in the description for my recovery resources, and let's get straight to the episode. So, you just had a binge. And I remember the moment I had a binge, and it would just keep on happening again and again and again. No matter how much I tried to diet, whatever diet I jumped onto, whether it's a little bit of a calorie deficit or a massive calorie deficit, I would just keep on binging. And I wouldn't understand really why I would keep on having these binge episodes. Maybe I would have them the next day. Maybe I'd have another binge episode 3 days later, maybe a week later. But the point is that I would keep on just falling into these binge eating episodes. And this episode, particularly this podcast episode, is specifically for you because you might be falling into this trap of binge eating, binge restrict, but you don't exactly know how to escape the cycle. So, as a little introduction, I struggled with binge eating 4 years ago from the time of making this podcast. And I escaped that cycle, and it's a terrible cycle. I completely understand this cycle because each time you would go through this cycle, each time, and the more you would binge, or the more I binged back then, your self-esteem keeps going lower and lower and lower. The intense feelings of guilt will get much stronger. Self-embarrassment would massively increase. And if it's your first time hearing this term, the binge restrict cycle, let me explain very briefly what it is. So let's start off anywhere in the cycle. So let's say you jump onto a diet, your body feels very deprived, so you start to have an intense urge to binge eat. And what do you do after a binge eating episode most of the time? Well, you want to try to make up for that binge, for all the things you've eaten. So you try to jump onto a really restrictive diet. Maybe you skip breakfast, maybe eat very little the next day, and then your body would sense deprivation, and you would lead to another binge eating episode. So to escape the cycle, we need to get rid of one thing. So we can't get rid of binging because we don't really exactly know what's causing this binging. But there is one thing that we can remove to end this cycle of binging, restricting, and it's to end dieting. And I know what you're thinking right now. You might be thinking, because I thought this back then, that if you stopped dieting after having a binge, then you're just going to gain even more and more and more weight. But we need to remember that no matter what our body weight is, we will keep on binging as long as our body senses deprivation. So whether your BMI is over 30, over 50, binge eating is just a symptom of deprivation, and it's a response. It's a natural response to famine. Our body doesn't know, or our body can't really see what's in the cupboards. Our body can't see what's in the fridge, what's in the freezer, what you have on your phone, what takeaway apps you have on your phone. If you live right next to McDonald's, KFC, Burger King nearby, just outside your house. Our body can't see any of that. It only senses things that's coming in and coming out. If it senses very little coming in, whether it's psychological fulfillment or physical fulfillment in your body, then it's really going to ramp up those hunger hormones. It's going to ramp up those need for that psychological fulfillment. And it's important to note that we often see binge eating as this very negative thing, but if we look back many, many years back, maybe, well, I don't know my timeline well, but if you think back to our caveman era, we didn't have the luxury of having food in our cupboards. We didn't even have cupboards. No breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's either nothing or feast. So feast or famine. So you probably might not have a meal for like 10 hours, a day, 2 days, even 3 days. So your body would ramp up the adrenaline, it would ramp up these hunger hormones, it would ramp up the anxiety, the heartbeat would massively increase in order for you to have this intense urge to do whatever it takes to get a meal, whether it's to hunt a boar, a tiger, even a mammoth. our body would do anything to get some food once it senses deprivation. So we need to remember that binge eating is a natural part and a natural response, whether you hate it or not. This is a natural response, and it's what's kept us alive all these years. So going back to the topic, what you should do after a binge eating episode to end this binge cycle, here are 3 things that helped me end my binge eating and escape that binge eating cycle, so I wouldn't have any urge to binge eat anymore. But overall, before we head to the 3 things, we need to remember that there's this common skill in psychology or counseling, and it works from this skill called DBT. You might have heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but there's this skill of DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, called opposite action. So DBT is a subset of CBT, or therapy skills, on managing difficult emotions. By the way, just a quick break from the podcast to let you know of my free hunger regulation webinar series, which is in the link in the description of this podcast. There's also an ebook version if you're more of a reader than a watcher. This is the perfect resource I wish I had when I struggled with binge eating years ago, which is used to guide you from everything you need to know, from why we binge, what are the binge triggers, and the eating pattern to stop binge eating. Because when we've been struggling with binge eating for so long, you and your body lose touch of what normal hunger and normal fullness is. You're constantly on feast or famine mode. So head to the link in the description of this podcast for the free hunger regulation resources to have a clear game plan to tackle binge eating for good. Anyway, let's get straight back to the episode. So there's a skill called opposite action, and this skill involves choosing to do exactly the opposite of what that difficult emotion is telling you to do. So let's put this into action. Let's say you have a binge eating episode and you're flooded with these difficult emotions of guilt, shame, embarrassment, and the thing you want to do, you really, really want to do, is to maybe skip breakfast, maybe just eat a salad, and you're going to start another diet. You're going to cut out chocolate, you're going to cut out cakes, you're going to cut out peanut butter. You might even get to the point of having this urge to purge, which is a very bulimic pattern. So if you're having these floods of difficult emotions, this DBT skill of managing emotions called opposite action, you should do the opposite of what your intense urge is telling you to do. So instead of jumping onto a diet or restricting even more, then just eat regular meals, jump onto having breakfast. If you're having this intense urge of thinking, oh, I should avoid toast because it's high in carbs, then eat the toast, which contains carbs. If you're having the intense urge to cut out chocolate, peanut butter, ice cream, then include it back into your diet. What we need to remember is that overall, with these skills, it's about remembering and being curious. Okay, I'm in this cycle of jumping onto a diet again and again after a binge eating episode. How about we try something different and see if it might lead to another outcome? It might lead to a better outcome. So aside from doing the opposite, let's be a bit more specific with this. So I want you to eat regular meals and maintain a level of 7 or 8 out of 10 in the fullness scale. So 10 out of 10 being Christmas dinner full, being very, very full that you just feel a bit sickly, and 0 out of 10 being nauseously hungry. So I want you to continuously keep yourself at a 7 or 8 out of 10, a comfortably full area. And I appreciate, like right after a binge eating episode, after eating so much food, maybe you might not feel massively hungry the next morning for breakfast. You might be a 9 out of 10 full, and that's completely alright. But the moment your hunger starts to kick in, maybe you might fall into a 5 out of 10 mid-morning. Then have a snack in between. Then top yourself up to be maybe a 7 or 8 out of 10. Maybe lunchtime comes. Maybe you're back to going to 4 out of 10 fullness. Then have a lunch that will just keep you around 7 or 8 out of 10 fullness. And I want you to sense it in your stomach. If you can't really sense it, or can't feel hunger or fullness, then listen to your internal body cues where your body is sensing or telling you it's wanting some food, it needs some energy. So things to look out for is maybe you're feeling a bit dizzy, maybe you're losing focus, or maybe your stomach might be grumbling a little bit. This is called listening and improving your skill of interoceptive awareness. So interoceptive awareness is about being in tune with your body. And after dieting for so long, either just being hungry or either being extremely full in the fullness scale, binging and severely restricting, our body starts to lose sense of what is actually comfortable fullness. So keep yourself at a 7 or 8 out of 10 fullness and try to sense these physical signs of hunger to train your body to recognize what comfortable fullness looks like. Number 2 is to ensure that all of your meals contain, as much as possible, fats, carbs, and protein. So instead of having for lunch, let's say a chicken salad, nothing else. So chicken, that's a protein source. Salad, a little bit of carbs in there, but not so much. It's lacking in fats and mostly carbs. So this is not going to signal to your body any satiety. But if you were to have, let's say, chicken, salad, rice, which is more carbs, and maybe some mayo, maybe some olive oil, that's a better example, hypothetically, then that's going to signal to your body that there's fats being absorbed, there's carbohydrates being absorbed, and protein being absorbed. It will signal to your body that it's going to keep yourself full and satisfied. Another example would be instead of having pasta with some pasta sauce, nothing else, then it's lacking in protein. So I want you to add maybe minced beef, maybe some tofu, maybe some vegan meatballs, maybe some animal-based meatballs, something to make sure that the meal contains fats, carbs, and protein. And finally, the third thing you should do to implement into your meals after a binge eating episode to reduce these binge eating episodes in the future is to include the foods you crave. So we talked about keeping your physical restriction at bay, but there's a difference between being full and satisfied. You can eat as much as possible, but if you're not including the foods you enjoy, maybe a little bit of brownie if you're having the craving for it, then you're still going to have this urge to binge eat because there's still a sense of deprivation if you're including the foods you crave. And it's been shown countless times again and again and again by the research that if you avoid this food, then it's going to increase its novelty. It's going to turn this food into a forbidden food, and psychology shows that we want things even more when we try to restrict ourselves from them. It's called the forbidden fruit phenomenon. So which is why you might see people, or if you, maybe for example, might be eating regular meals, regular snacks, but you're still having binge eating episodes. I want you to think, are you still including the foods you actually crave? And by crave, I mean not just having a tiny bit, like tiny bite of it, and then just maybe filling yourself up with water. And I mean filling yourself up comfortably where you're fully satisfied. And we need to remember that the more you've deprived yourself of the foods you've craved, then it's normal and expected. You should expect that you're going to have a much, much larger portion once you have these cravings, because previously you've been depriving yourself of these. And if you're worried if you're going to be giving yourself permission to eat these foods, and you're going to never stop eating them, we need to remember, if you're including regular meals, keeping yourself at a 7 or 8 out of 10 in the fullness scale, having some snacks in between your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, ensuring your meals contain fats, carbs, and protein, your body would have no reason to binge eat on these foods that you crave because you're satisfying this mental craving and you're satisfying also the physical cravings, the physical, mechanical hunger. So those are the things you should do after a binge eating episode to prevent further binge eating cycles. So in summary of this little episode, remember, if you're having the intense urge to jump onto a diet, how about we try something else different? Because we know that jumping onto diets right after binge eating is signaling even more deprivation. So how about at least for once, try something different? Let's try to go all in and try to do the opposite. Just as the DBT, the dialectical behavior skill of managing difficult emotions shows, called opposite action, let's do the opposite of what these intense emotions are wanting us to do. So number 1, try to eat regular meals and snacks in between your breakfast, mid-morning snack, lunch, mid-afternoon snack, and dinner, and keep yourself physically at a 7 or 8 out of 10 fullness. Number 2 is to ensure all of your meals contain fats, carbs, and protein to ensure that the meal is balanced, to signal to your body this is a balanced meal and it's not having these mechanical cravings. And finally, number 3, include the foods you crave. So if you're craving for a piece of brownie, then have that piece of brownie. Don't try to substitute it for a piece of banana, or maybe just try to chug it down with some water or some sparkling drinks or some diet sodas to ignore this craving. So we're trying to get rid of mental deprivation and physical deprivation in order to end this binge eating cycle. So I hope you found this episode helpful, and if you're listening to this episode right now and you just finished a binge eating episode and you're having these intense urges to jump onto a diet, I understand that it's really difficult and it's not easy to go through these difficult emotions and choose the opposite of what these emotions are telling you to do. But try to be curious and try to use each binge eating episode as a learning opportunity to find out and pick out previously where some deprivation popping out into my life. Was I previously hungry throughout the day or maybe yesterday? Was I skipping meals? Was I ignoring my cravings? So try to be curious and use each binge eating episode as a learning point. So if you enjoyed this episode, I'd highly appreciate it if you rated this podcast a 5-star rating so other people could learn what they should do after a binge eating episode in order to escape this terrible binge eating cycle. I've been there and it's not easy. And if you feel like you want to work with a dietitian who struggles with binge eating and has knowledge on binge eating recovery, then jump onto the link in the description of this podcast or head over to bingedietitian.com where you can just find my services, and I offer a 30-minute free discovery call just to see if we're a fit to work with each other and see what options I can give you to serve you the best way possible to end your binge eating cycle. And I also have freebies such as my binge eating recovery newsletter, my ebooks, and webinars. So thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Struggling with binge eating? Gain access to my exclusive self-paced binge eating freedom course found in the link in the description of this podcast. My course is everything I wish I knew when I struggled with binge eating, but it's all wrapped up into one easy to understand platform. You'll finally learn how to put an end to binge eating and put an end to food dictating everything you do, controlling your life. Access it now in the link in the description of this podcast.